Welcome back, listeners. You are listening to Crime Tales from Travels, the show where we highlight crimes and similar stories from places we have traveled to and from, places we have spent a fair amount of time, or places we have traveled, maybe even just passing through. And what we have for you today is an episode from Columbus, Ohio. This is the case of the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. So stick around to learn more. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. I am your host, Kimberly Rotet. Before we dive in, please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple and Spotify. Leave a good review if you like the content. We'd love to have you engage with the podcast on social media. You can follow us on Instagram by searching Crime Tales from Travels. We also have a Blue Sky account and a TikTok account. Again, just search Crime Tales from Travels. You can also check out additional content on YouTube by searching the Cairo Productions Network. And you search that on YouTube because Crime Tales from Travels is a part of the Cairo Productions Network. And as always, show notes from this episode, as well as others, will be listed on the website cairoproductions.net. If you appreciate the content and you would like to support the podcast further, you have a couple different options. The first is the easiest. YouTube, like and subscribe. In addition to the podcast there, we also post videos about recent cases in the news and some research that we're currently doing. You can also support us on Patreon by searching Cairo Productions Network on Patreon. So let's go ahead and jump into the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. And the case today that we're going to discuss, I think it's certainly something that a lot of people believe is just a truly kind of perplexing case. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer, he disappeared in 2006, and to date, he has not been found. Before we dive into the details of the case, as well as some of the theories that have emerged, let's do what we do. How are we connected to Columbus, Ohio? Because again, Crime Tales from Travels, right? Our travels. Again, the premise of the podcast, the locations make the list if we've just spent any time within that location. And sometimes the locations make the podcast if we've just kind of traveled through, perhaps on a road trip. Maybe we stayed, in an overnight in that particular location. You get the idea. We are not just picking locations of crimes we want to cover or the crimes themselves that we want to cover, but we are choosing locations that are personal to us from travel or time spent in that location. Then we are researching those cases and then seeking to share them with you. But let's put that into context with Columbus, Ohio. So we both worked in Northern Ohio at our respective universities. However, we regularly had state conferences or workshops in alternative locations, i.e. at other institutions or universities. Additionally, we had friends and colleagues who worked at Ohio State. We traveled through informally when we were on our way to and from a location. I recall very specifically a hotel debacle that my spouse and I had with a Taekwondo tournament that she was participating in. But we're not Buckeye fans necessarily by any means, but we are familiar with the university. So that's how we have come to choose this particular location. But let's go ahead and jump into the case overview. So what is it that we know? What is some background content? We know that this case has baffled law enforcement for just shy of 20 years now. There have been a lot of internet sleuths that have investigated this case, and this case has received coverage, but even after some time, there still tends to be a whole lot more questions than answers. What else do we know? We know that Brian Shaffer, at the time of his disappearance, was a 27-year-old second-year medical student at Ohio State University. We know that he was the son of Randy and Renee Shaffer. We also know that in March of 2006, Brian's mother, Renee, lost her battle, and I'm terribly sorry if I butcher this name, but it looks like melodiaplastic syndrome, which is a cancer in which blood cells within the bone marrow do not mature. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not a medical professional. I'm not that kind of doctor, but it looks like melodiaplastic syndrome. But when I had to go look it up, it was a cancer in which the blood cells within bone marrow do not mature the way that they should. But Brian's mother passed less than a month before he disappeared. Family and friends would share after his disappearance that Brian, outwardly appeared to be handling her passing well, but they did also recognize that they could tell that it was weighing on him. We know that on the night of March 31st, 2006, he went out to dinner with his dad. It was a Friday. It had been a long week, and he was winding down after the long week with dinner with his dad. Over the course of the day, Brian had been in contact with his girlfriend, Alexis Wagner. She had been driving back to Toledo, where she was from. She was visiting them before she and Brian were to go on a trip that following Monday. They were scheduled to fly out to Florida. And that's part of the other thing that we know is that they were scheduled for that trip, but families of both Alexis and Brian thought that perhaps he would be proposing to Alexis on this particular trip. Later on that night of March 31st in 2006, we know that Brian went out with his friends to celebrate the start of spring break. They had visited the Ugly Tuna Saloon, which is a popular campus bar within the campus area. And we know that surveillance footage shows Brian entering the bar with his friends at about 1:15 on April 1st, because, again, March 31st and 1:15 a.m. on April 1st, there's obviously a new day, but they actually started out at the Ugly Tuna on March 31st earlier in the evening, but they had come back to the Ugly Tuna, what was the wee hours of the morning of April 1st, and that's where he's not seen leaving the bar. Despite extensive investigation, there have been no definitive clues that have surfaced to explain this disappearance. Brian's last known interaction was with his friend, William, quote, Clint Florence, and another acquaintance, Meredith Reed. Let's kind of back up to the timeline here. I mentioned that they had been in the bar earlier in the night. So he had dinner with his dad. He'd gone out with some friends. He had met some friends at the Ugly Tuna at around 9 p.m. Around 10 p.m., Brian stepped out of the bar to take a call from his girlfriend, Alexis. Recall, she was driving back to Toledo from Columbus so she could visit her parents. They were set to go out on a trip on that following Monday. But eventually, he gets off that phone call, and he and his friends make their way to a couple different locations, having one shot each at each of the spots on their way towards what's called the Arena District in Columbus. It was around midnight that Brian and Clint met Clint's friend, Meredith, in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus. And it was Meredith who gave them a ride back to the Ugly Tuna where they had started the evening, and the three hung out for a while there. At some point, once they got back to the Ugly Tuna, Brian had distanced himself from Meredith and Clint, indicating that he was going to go talk to the band. At around 1:55 a.m., Brian was seen outside the bar talking to two women. The camera interaction, the CCTV footage, it's grainy, but you can tell from based upon what he was wearing that it was him. They're talking, they see the two women leave, and Brian exits from the security camera footage. Now, that bar, the Ugly Tuna Saloon, closed at around 2 a.m. So it was around 2 a.m. that Clint and Meredith left the bar, assuming that Brian had either gone home or maybe had left with someone else. For the research of this podcast, I watched a couple of things on YouTube, and I'll try to, for sure, link them within the show notes. But it was noted that Clint and Meredith kind of took a spin back throughout the bar to see if they could find Brian. So it was closing time. They're finishing up. Brian says he's going to go talk with the band about 5 minutes before, close, and he ends up kind of talking with some other people. But it was noted that Brian did come back into the bar from being outside. Clint had said that he saw Brian one last time when Brian came in from talking with those two women outside of the Ugly Tuna. But then moments later, he was gone. Now, as the weekend progressed, Brian's family, his girlfriend, and his friends, they tried to call him, but they really just didn't have any luck. But it wasn't until Monday morning, though, when Brian failed to show up for the flight for his vacation, that family and friends reported him missing. I won't lie, I struggled with this. I'm not law enforcement or an investigator for that matter, but isn't the first 48 hours of someone going missing the most critical? And I really can't help but wonder, though, were they concerned that they would be told if they didn't go that, maybe Brian's an adult, you're going to have to wait? I feel like when we listen to stories like this so often, particularly with adults or people over the age of 18, if someone's missing, law enforcement say, you're going to have to wait. And I guess it's true. He could have gone off on his own. That would not be, unheard of at all. But doing research on cases like this, I feel like we at least need to acknowledge that we hear kind of two sides of the coin. The first 48 hours is the most critical, but particularly if they're of age, law enforcement are not always as quick to respond within that 48-hour time frame, which they say is the most critical. But those are kind of the summary of what we know, right? The summary of the evening and how the evening progressed from dinner with his dad to the time of his disappearance. But let's segue to, if we can, into the investigation. As you can imagine, once he was reported missing for the weekend, there was an extensive search and investigation. Sergeant John Hurst was the detective assigned to Brian's case. Hurst, along with his colleagues, began their investigation by starting at the kind of maybe the obvious choice, the Ugly Tuna Saloon. Police reviewed the surveillance footage there extensively and confirmed that Brian never appeared on any cameras leaving the bar's main entrance or emergency exits. Now, for some of the YouTube content that I watched, the police, they scoured the CCTV footage. They caught Brian kind of speaking to those two females, but as he wandered away and then out of frame, that was really the last point that they ever saw him on any of that footage until that point. They could kind of track his movements throughout the bar, even earlier in the night to that point. So around 1:55 a.m. when he stopped talking to those females and he went out of frame, no one ever saw Brian again. Now, the Ugly Tuna Saloon was located in a high-traffic area, so there were multiple security cameras within this space, not just with this bar, but with that area in general. There were a lot of different businesses there. There still are, so there are going to be multiple security cameras, making it highly unusual for someone to disappear without being recorded in some capacity. And this just completely baffled police. They could follow Brian's movements all evening until a certain point, and then just all of a sudden, they couldn't. When Brian was not found and clues became even more sparse, investigators did consider that Shaffer could have changed his clothes and maybe wore a hat as to not be seen. They also thought perhaps maybe he exited through a service door in the back. That back door, it did lead to an area that was under construction, and law enforcement believed that terrain might have been difficult to navigate in the dark if someone was sober, let alone if someone had consumed alcohol. But friends and family and even the FBI were involved in the search, and there was no substantial evidence that was found that he left through that back space. Brian's phone was never recovered, but it briefly rang several times before going silent. When police and law enforcement and investigators showed up to his apartment to try to do or widen their search, his apartment showed no signs of foul play at the time of his disappearance, and neither did his bank account. It remained untouched. As the investigation continued, there were a couple of strange things that occurred. Now, let's back up here. To discuss some of these strange things that occurred, let's remember the timeline. So the reminder is that the last known camera footage before he disappeared was Saturday, April 1st, 2006, around 1:55 a.m. On Tuesday, April 18th, 2006, someone broke into Brian's apartment. A little bit odd. Police didn't know if it was connected. They couldn't necessarily make a determination as to whether it was connected or not. Something else that was a little bit strange, Alexis Wagner, his girlfriend, if you recall, not strange that she would routinely call Brian's phone. She cared. She wanted to reach out just to see if it was turned off still, or she could leave a voicemail. But she would routinely call Brian's phone. Usually, it always went to voicemail. Until one night, it didn't. It rang 3 times before disconnecting. When this was looked into, it was written off by the phone company as a fluke, but that was until September 11th, 2006, when Brian's cell phone pinged off a cell phone tower in Hilliard, Ohio, which is only about 14 miles away from Columbus, Ohio. So kind of geographically, it's really not that far away. The police received many tips over the years, but nothing ever panned out. And there were sightings that were noted, Michigan, Texas, and even the country of Sweden, but nothing ever panned out. Now, there were a couple of additional bits of information that might make it a little easier for someone to identify Brian if they happen to think that they recognize his picture. But Brian's favorite band was Pearl Jam, and he'd actually gotten a tattoo on his arm of his favorite band. And actually at a concert in Cincinnati, the lead singer of Pearl Jam even gave a call out talking about Brian and how if you know anything to please come forward. So clearly there were an awful lot of people, his friends, his family, law enforcement in the area, and even Pearl Jam, making pleas with just the public that if you know something, say something. Unfortunately, nothing ever led to Brian being found, whether that be him alive or his body. And we have an awful lot of questions, right? Particularly when someone's body is never recovered. And here we are, not quite 20 years after the fact, and you can't help but wonder, is he alive? Is he not alive? What are some of the theories? And there are a few of them, so let's discuss some of those. Some of the prevalent theories were it was an accidental death. Some speculate that Brian may have found his way through an unmonitored exit and possibly into that construction site behind the bar. Maybe he fell into a dangerous area. Foul play. Others believe that Brian may have been attacked or potentially abducted, given the bar's location near a very kind of high crime area within the Columbus area. This is considered a possibility. There's also the possibility that it was voluntary disappearance. Some theories suggest that Brian wanted to start a new life, citing personal struggles, potentially that included his mother's very recent passing. Another theory was the involvement of friends. There had been some speculation regarding Clint Florence's behavior. He refused to take a polygraph, and that led to suspicion, though no evidence has ever linked him to Brian's disappearance. But obviously, those are just theories. But in recent years, they've done some additional digging. I believe that they kind of vetted out what happened at that construction site and did some ground penetrating radar. Obviously, if he was abducted or attacked, we may never know what happened to him. If almost 20 years later, if it was a voluntary disappearance and there's no pings on his social security number, any of his bank accounts, that might be kind of impressive to kind of go 20 years and not be detected. The involvement of his friends, whilst a polygraph test is not strong enough to be admissible in court, it certainly would speak volumes as to police, at least, that if someone refused to take it, even with the presence of an attorney, like you could understand why it might make them raise their eyebrows or make them wonder a little bit extra if that individual has something to hide. But still, we're left with a lot of unanswered questions, and there seem to be plenty of those as well. How did Brian leave without being seen on camera? Was there someone inside the bar that was potentially waiting on him? Why did his phone ring multiple times before being disconnected? Why did it ping off that cell phone tower? A lot of questions that we just don't always have answers to, and sadly, these questions without answers prevail. And it is only at this point Brian's brother Derek that remains alive. Unfortunately, Brian's father Randy passed away in 2008, about 2 years after his son disappeared, due to an accident in the yard. I can't imagine being Brian's brother Derek to have lost his mother, his brother disappeared, and then only a couple years later to have lost his father in an accident in the yard. The other thing with these questions that kind of always seem to prevail, it does kind of always continue to bring up additional questions about certain developments. And at one point, a private investigator was hired by the attorney. His name is Neil Rosenberg, and he was the attorney of Clint Florence. Now, much was made, as I mentioned earlier, about Florence's unwillingness to take a polygraph test. Rosenberg indicated, though, that he learned that the Columbus PD thought that Brian was alive. So that's certainly maybe an additional development if that turned out to be true. Many close to Brian have criticized Florence for not being forthcoming enough. It was reported that as soon as detectives got involved, he got really quiet. It was also noted that Brian's former girlfriend, Alexis, also believes Florence knows more than what he is letting on. And additionally, years later, Columbus PD indicate they receive multiple tips a month, but still nothing has helped bring any sort of resolution or continue to propel this case forward in a significant positive light. But as we wrap up, we would like to ask that you continue to search for us on Instagram. You can also find us at Carrot Up Productions Network on YouTube, where we post additional content about not just these cases, about the news, what's going on in the news, and things that we're researching. There are show notes and blog posts at caroproductions.net. Just some additional details with maps and links and highlights and things of that nature to try to help provide a pictorial representation of how we are finding our material. We certainly want to thank our listeners for tuning in. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review if you like today's episode. And always remember, stay safe, stay curious, and remember that the truth is often stranger and more disturbing than fiction.